Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating era of history, looking right at the period between 1450 and 1750. This is the era where the map of the world was fundamentally redrawn, and not just by exploration, but by the explosive expansion of massive land-based empires. We're going to unpack the exact strategies, basically the ultimate playbook, that rulers used to build these massive states, maintain absolute order, and control resources on a scale that was, frankly, unprecedented.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty, seriously, think about this massive historical challenge for a second. How do you actually conquer? And more importantly, how do you hold on to vast stretches of the globe and millions of diverse people without modern tech? No internet, no telephones, no rapid transit. The rulers of this era faced that exact puzzle, and the solutions they came up with were as ruthless as they were brilliant.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Just look at the sheer scale of three of the dominant powers of this period, the Islamic gunpowder empires. They completely dominated the landscape. You've got the Mughal Empire blanketing almost the entirety of South Asia. Right next door, the Safavid Empire dominates huge stretches of the Middle East. And further west, the mighty Ottoman Empire spans all the way from southern Europe through the Middle East and down into North Africa. Grasping the sheer physical size of these territories is absolutely step one to understanding the immense power these rulers held.
So how did they push those borders out so far? Well, the foundational secret, the absolute game changer of this era, was gunpowder. This period saw a massive, rapid shift in military strategy. These empires didn't just slowly creep outward. They actively drove their expansion, using massive cannons and cutting-edge, devastating new weaponry. Gunpowder wasn't just a shiny new weapon. It was literally the prerequisite for playing on the global stage. If you didn't have this tech, you simply couldn't compete.
Here's our playbook for today. 1. The gunpowder expansion. 2. Managing massive populations. 3. Financing the empire. 4. Architecture and divine right. And 5. Shifts in global beliefs.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the gunpowder expansion and redrawing the map.
This expansion wasn't just an isolated thing. It was happening everywhere, completely upending the balance of power. Over in East Asia, the Manchus successfully invaded Beijing, completely ousting the Ming dynasty and set up their own Qing dynasty. And, as we just talked about, the Islamic empires were dominating their regions. But naturally, when you have these massive, heavily armed empires bumping right up against each other, friction is absolutely inevitable. Intense political and religious conflicts were constantly sparking, like the fierce rivalry between the Safavids and the Mughals, or over in Africa, the major throwdown between the Songhai Empire and Morocco. Expanding the borders was just the beginning. Fighting off your equally ambitious neighbors was an everyday reality.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 2, managing massive populations or the administration game.
Because once you actually conquer all that territory, you immediately face an arguably harder problem. How do you keep everyone in line? Rulers needed highly trained, deeply loyal people to enforce their will. The Ottoman Empire had a highly specific, ingenious, and pretty ruthless method for this called devshirme. Essentially, they actively recruited soldiers and bureaucrats directly from within their vast conquered populations. This wasn't just about drafting an army. It was about cultivating a dedicated administrative force that relied directly on the central government, which really helped firmly legitimize the empire's power and maintain strict order.
Meanwhile, down in South Asia, the Mughals leaned on a different strategy. They used figures known as zemindars. These were local military leaders who were handed very specific critical duties by the central government, most notably collecting taxes. By bringing these existing local figures into the imperial administration, the Mughals could extend their reach and make sure everyone complied, even way out in the provinces.
And if we look over at Japan, we see yet another fascinating approach to control. The Japanese rulers focused heavily on professionalizing their military by creating a formal network of salaried samurai. By literally paying these warriors a salary, the rulers guaranteed their direct loyalty, turning them from independent fighters into a professionalized force that consolidated the central government's power. Different regions, different tactics, but the ultimate goal was exactly the same: total control.
Which brings us to Section 3, financing the empire and collecting the wealth.
So the crucial point is that maintaining professional armies and sprawling bureaucracies is just astronomically expensive. You simply can't run an empire without rigorous systems guaranteeing that revenue flows right to the top. Take the Ming dynasty in China. They didn't just casually ask for a cut of the harvest. Ming rulers demanded hard currency on top of taking a percentage of the farmer's agricultural product. It was a strict, multi-layered approach to wealth extraction designed to keep the empire's bank accounts full and its power totally secure.
Moving right along to Section 4, Architecture and Divine Right, which is basically propaganda in stone.
Now, this is one of my absolute favorite tactics in the playbook, using architecture as pure psychology. Rulers didn't just rely on force and taxes, they messed with your head. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The Taj Mahal. In the Islamic world, Mughal leaders poured staggering resources into building breathtaking mausoleums and mosques. It wasn't just to make something beautiful, it was a highly calculated move. These massive structures stood as constant, towering reminders of the leadership's deep religious faithfulness, permanently wiring their political power to divine devotion in the minds of the people.
And you see this powerful concept of divine justification tailored to specific cultures all across the globe. In Europe, kings pushed the divine right, the idea that their unchallengeable authority came directly from God, and built lavish monstrosities like the Palace of Versailles to visually cement that status. As we just saw, the Islamic world used religious faithfulness and structures like the Taj Mahal. And over in the Americas, rulers continued deeply ingrained religious practices to maintain order, which included human sacrifice in Mesoamerica, as well as building monumental, awe-inspiring structures like the Incan Temple of the Sun. Whether it's a palace, a mausoleum, or a temple, the psychological message is exactly the same. Our power is ordained by a higher authority, so don't even think about messing with it.
Finally, Section 5, Shifts in Global Beliefs, or what I like to call the cultural earthquakes.
For our final chapter, we have to look at how the actual foundations of society were shifting between 1450 and 1750. In Europe, the cultural map was completely ripped apart by the Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther. This wasn't some minor disagreement, it was a fundamental fracture that led directly to the Catholic Counter-Reformation. These movements completely reshaped Christianity, bringing dramatic differences in worship to the forefront and cementing entirely new theological identities. European identity would literally never be the same. We see similar, deeply impactful theological fractures elsewhere too. Just look at the dynamic between the Ottomans and the Safavids. These neighboring superpowers were already fierce rivals, but their differences were deeply rooted in theology, not just territory. The intense political friction between these two specific empires actually exacerbated and deepened the divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims during this time. It's a textbook example of how imperial politics and religious theology were incredibly intertwined.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that these cultural earthquakes didn't just cause divisions, they also created beautiful new syntheses. In South Asia, the sheer size of the Mughal Empire brought huge diverse populations into really close contact. And this profound intermingling of existing Hindu and Muslim cultures directly led to the emergence of an entirely new belief system, Sikhism. It brilliantly shows how the massive scale of these empires forced cultures to interact and evolve in completely unprecedented ways.
So, from 1450 to 1750, these rulers used gunpowder, fierce taxation, organized bureaucracies, and monumental propaganda to hold together half the world. But here's the question I want to leave you with today. Empires inevitably fall, but the core tools of control, technology, taxes, and ideology, they always remain. When you look at our modern world, which of these historical tools do you think is the most powerful today? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.